Viewer discretion is advised. Chapter 11. Hindsight. The Sandia Mountains. These mountains were beautiful this time of year. The pastel skies of pinks and blues, overlooking the forest life below, covered a landscape boasting of ponderosa pine trees and breathtaking wilderness. And at the base of these mountains below, beyond the mountain's thicket, a sharp contrast is noted. As pine needles become thistles upon dry and sandy cactus. This announcing a small community nestled at the foot of these mountains, a small town in New Mexico. A town known as Cedar Crest. And within the outskirts of this community, sitting quietly with elegance, was a beautiful and rather stylish home. Made of Spanish architecture, it had multiple levels. And with its southwestern decor, the house came with a rustic, yet very plush appeal. Among the upper patio, facing the surrounding forest, stood two armed guards, keeping an eye on their environment. It was a Sinaloa safe house. And while passing through, a particularly important family member was making use of it. He was returning with some others on their way to a certain objective, temporarily using the oversized flat as a rest stop for the evening. This man in question was none other than the Sinaloa's crime boss, Chavez Cruz. Having been seized many years back, he was happy to have it in his possession once again, thanks to a trade with the FBI. A trade of the wanted cartel figure, Lazar. Since he moved back in, he didn't have to change much, as the prior owners had made a deal at the auction for all the items that came with the house. Ergo, most of the decor remained, and as much as anyone would harbor a deep hatred for the cartel, they would only be perpetuating a falsehood to deny the cartel had damn good taste. Having said this, he was pleased to be back in a comfortable setting with pricey artwork, Spanish mosaics, and priceless antiques throughout the home. On the other hand, it did not work out so well for the buyers of said former auction that had seized his family estate. And it had also not occurred to them, while feeling safe in their isolated mansion, that now, with a global pandemic on the horizon, coupled with this new arrangement that the Sinaloa had with the FBI, all bets were off, and its former owners might be dropping in for a little visit. It was an older couple, well-to-do and enjoying their retirement. The repossession was over in seconds. Her in the shower, and him napping in the living room. But that was years ago. And now, with it back in their possession, the house remained somewhat quiet while Chavez's security detail kept guard. Upon closer observation and coming from within the home, one could hear laughter while the men posted out simply held firm composures. And looking through a particular bedroom window, one would see a familiar face and a relatively new CEO. Because there in the bed, a carnal display unfolds as two women and a man lay naked, each sexually pleasing Mr. Cruz. From a further view of the house, as if standing across the street now, a series of misfortunes for the crime boss began to advance from the forests around. Suddenly, the two exterior guards, as if struck by bullets that hadn't uttered a sound, simultaneously keeled over and fell 2 floors to the concrete driveway below. Immediately following the blow to the cartel defense, the front lawns to the house became crawling with police. While running quietly, all aiming their weapons at the small mansion before them, they readied themselves for their invasion. Meanwhile, an oblivious Chavez enjoys his view in front of him. While lying on his back naked, he looked down at the 2 beautiful women and the attractive gentleman. All smiling up at him, they commanded exotic tones, each framed with dark hair. One woman looked deep into Chavez's eyes as the other woman began to lower her head, beginning to please her lover, her face slowly disappearing between his legs. And while his eyes began to close, he could see the beautiful male creature before him smile, encouraging him to succumb to the bliss of it all. Suddenly, causing Chavez to flinch, several loud noises sound off as his doors were broken in and gunfire was heard. He quickly sat up, wiping what felt like blood from his face, and opened his eyes. There in front of him, once a beautiful specimen, now had a gaping wound in his forehead. And as he collapsed, the woman once pleasing Cruz jumped up from the bed and looked down as she screamed. Chavez flinched a few more times as 2 more gunshots rang out and 2 more beautiful creatures met their quick and sudden death. Now, surrounded by his dead companions, Chavez slowly scooted back and looked over at his gun on the table across the bed. Knowing it was too far as the threat in front of him approached, he simply slid to a sitting position and pulled a sheet around his waist. He looked nervous, yet angry, at the same time as he began to shout at the invading police officers. What is the meaning of this? We have a deal. And wasting no time, an officer walked up to Chavez and put handcuffs on him. He then attached the other end of the handcuffs to the bed. Chavez kept protesting verbally, but did not physically resist, as he knew what would become of him if they felt he were a threat. The man who cuffed him was thin and rather short, while he wore a black bushy mustache. Being Hispanic, he too had a darker shade of tone, while his eyes were an intense darker brown. He was much higher in rank than the rest of the officers, as he looked at Chavez and simply turned as he walked up to 2 of his men. He then spoke a few words as they each acknowledged him with an audible 10-4. Then he turned away from them as they drew their weapons toward Chavez and maintained their aim. As they just stood there, aiming their weapons, no one spoke to Chavez as the man who cuffed him left the room. Now, sitting there, confused, only covered with a sheet, cuffed to the blood-stained bed, he stared at the 2 officers, pointing their weapons at him. Just outside the horrific bloodbath, the officer who had cuffed Chavez approached a vehicle in the driveway. The vehicle was an unmarked black SUV. As the officer approached, the truck's front window rolled down. There, sitting in the car, were 2 men. The officer then spoke, the vehicle's occupants remaining quiet as he did so. "All clear, sir. The target is in the master bedroom." The man in the driver's seat peered into the back of the vehicle and then looked back at the officer and nodded in approval. He then gave an order to the officer. "Move your men out. We will take it from here." And as the officer then moved away from the car, He signaled to his entire unit with a hand gesture as all his men began to vacate the area. It was at this point the back passenger door of the SUV opened as Thomas Shields exited from within its darkened interior. Meanwhile, inside, and still chained up to the bed, Chavez awaits with frustrated curiosity as Thomas and two other agents appeared. Chavez, only knowing Thomas as a crooked agent, looked at him with shock as he spoke. "You, what is the meaning of this, Senior Shields? We had an agreement." And while Thomas slowly crossed the room, he minded his trench coat as he dodged through the dead bodies. He came to Chavez's side and gently sat down next to him and waited. The two officers lowered their weapons as they quickly vacated. And as Thomas sat there for a moment in silence, he then looked down at the floor as the two agents that accompanied him now stood guard. Eventually, after making Chavez wait for quite some time, he responded to his hostage's remarks. "Indeed we do, Mr. Chavez. But it appears as though we will be making a few changes." Chavez looked at him and scowled. Thomas, nevertheless, persisted. "You see, with our current arrangement, you still function independently. Consider this to be no more. You will now be working for us, and we must be certain of your cooperation. Because as you know, meeting with you in our own jurisdiction can be so tedious. Bribes must be executed, and people must be executed as well. Then you have your search warrants to forge. And let's not forget about all the paperwork local law enforcement needs. The list goes on and on. It is quite the nightmare. You see how this isn't exactly sustainable, Mr. Cruz." Chavez snarled back at Thomas. "It's not supposed to be fucking sustainable because meeting with me was not part of the fucking arrangement. And to hell with you if you think I am going to work for your Russian clients. You made your deal. You have your man. I would have rather seen Lazar crucified, alive. And if given the chance, I wouldn't hesitate to break him out of that prison just so I could do exactly that. So why, senor? Why the fuck would you want an open line of communication with me?" Thomas turned to Chavez, leaned toward him, and pointed in his face. And with an excited expression while speaking in a hushed tone, he answered, "That, my friend, is an excellent question." He then relaxed and regained his previous posture, looking toward the floor as he continued to speak. "You see, there will be some changes happening on this planet within a short time. We will need individuals who understand how to inspire people to fall in line. Individuals like you. Individuals like Lazar." He looked over at Chavez and continued to speak. "Of all the militaries in the world, a united cartel would rival the best. They know how to spy like the professionals, coordinate like the elite. But most of all, they don't have a moral compass creating unnecessary obstacles. When these changes come to pass, we will need the two of you to cooperate. The world is changing, and it will be changing much more. Alliances must be made now. Alliances must be made, or the prospects of which must be handled. I am sure you understand." Thomas stood up and walked toward the door and turned around. He then straightened up his demeanor and spoke loud and clearly to his hostage. "Once these changes come, we have already set in motion Lazar's escape. You will be working for my client now. And soon, you will cooperate with this counterfaction of yours. You will cooperate with Lazar and the Beltran Leyva. You will be posted north, here, in the States, and Lazar, south." He looked at Chavez, somewhat gauging his behavior, and awaited a response. Cruz looked at Thomas and argued the order given to him. Meanwhile, outside at the vehicle where Thomas and the other two agents had come from, The opposite back door to the SUV opened as a man stepped outside who was dressed in a black suit and proceeded for the doors of the large house. All the while, inside, Chavez tried outmatching his captor in an argument that continued to unfold. "Do you not remember Agent Fuckhead?" I answer to my own clients. "Not to you. And with our agreement, you will be standing down. Myself and my operations are to be left alone. If anything happens to me, Senor Marquez is only one phone call away from exposing your corrupt ass. So, Senior Shields, with all due respect, kindly fuck off." Thomas smiled and quickly responded, "Do not forget, Mr. Cruz, it is these same Americans I still work for," he said, using air quotes as he did so. "Americans that I still maintain power with. I could make your life here quite irritating if I were to signal a specific target." That's when Chavez looked at Thomas as though he were a piece of trash laying on the floor before him and spoke with disdain in his voice. "I have killed many of these Americans. I have had them on their knees before me. On their knees before being eliminated. They have spoken of you, you know. They know you are a traitor. They know you are corrupt. I am not afraid of your petty threats, traitor." Thomas smiled and shook his head, looking at Chavez and sighed. "Okay, but remember, when we're working together in the future, I tried to convince you to do so in a reasonable manner." Chavez looked at him with confusion as a man came through the doors. The same man that had just come from the car. It was Arlo Brooks, and he immediately looked down at the handcuffed hostage below Thomas on the bed. Chavez then felt something strange overcome him. He felt his airways quickly becoming obstructed by some strange force. And as he began to slightly panic, Chavez looked over to Thomas, who was just looking down at him with disappointment in his eyes as he began to choke. And while his mind directed him to a dark place, as if it were no longer under his control, images flashed before his eyes as he saw, under dark skies, a great chasm with a wall of flames approaching. He could feel his own skin begin to peel off as he reached up to steady a portion of it dripping from his own face. The dark skies above held intensely dark clouds as they parted to let evil through. There, descending upon Chavez, an angel of death came to where he stood. And once the ghastly creature stood before him, a foul odor assaulted his senses as it knelt down over a woman, now laying bloodied before them. It was his late mother, appearing to be somewhat alive and much younger. She laid half naked upon the ground as the angel held a knife as it looked to Chavez and spoke. And as he listened, he felt his flesh begin to burn as if the fire had engulfed his entire body.
"Mommy's here,"
the angel spoke as it moved the knife to his mother's abdomen and split her guts wide open, allowing all her bowels to fall to the sides. The angel continued to speak as it looked at him, its eyes growing darker and its voice growing deeper.
"Eat, my little angel."
Suddenly, Chavez came to, hunched over on the bed. He was back in the room with Thomas and Arlo. He could barely make out either of them through his teary eyes as he noticed Arlo approach him. As he did so, he began speaking, Chavez feeling a deepness in his voice that beckoned him back to the darkness he had just come from. And as Arlo proceeded to speak, despite how softly he did, his voice echoed through Chavez's entire being.
"I assume we have a deal, Mr. Cruz."
After dealing with the Sinaloa boss before him, Arlo quickly turned and left as quickly as he'd arrived. Then, Thomas, still in the room, looked to Chavez one last time before leaving himself and left his new partner with a few last words while casually pointing to where Arlo had left. "I mean, that's some fucked up shit. Am I right?" he said, slightly rubbing the situation in by turning the proverbial knife with his words. He then turned and left, as his voice grew louder while he finished his conversation with Chavez, quickly disappearing from sight. Anyhow, don't say I didn't warn you, Mr. Cruz. And with that, Agent Shields was gone, leaving Cruz alone in the sarcophagus-like bedroom filled with fine, handcrafted, blood-stained furniture. Still in the nude, only covered by a thin sheet, Cruz looked at where his captor was leaving with a confused anger growing across his face. Having blood spattered across his brow, he looked over at his cuffed wrist and began to let the confusion dominate the anger. Then, he struggled a little to try and break free, but to no avail. He looked back at the door, and then back to his cuffs, and struggled again, realizing he was being left there, shackled to his bed. As Thomas made his way through the home, he had to dodge several dead bodies, as there were several more Sinaloa guards, which had met the same fate as the nude trio that were once entertaining Cruz. As he did so, he walked down a dark hallway, listening to his newest employee's first complaint. "Hey, Agent Dick Hole, are you gonna undo my chains or what?" Thomas smiled and proceeded down the hall, paying little mind to the shouted suggestion now coming from across the large home. Suddenly, while coming to a large room, he saw a sparkle of light which had caught his eye. And looking over, he saw where the small flash had come from, now viewing a large pool just beyond a massive glass window. Seeming to be curious, he walked toward the glass as he approached the door's handle, knowing he was going the opposite direction that his team had recently gone. Nevertheless, he slid the door open as he walked out onto the massive pool deck. The pool was surrounded by Spanish artwork upon a hand-laid stone patio. Unlike the forest, this small castle found itself surrounded by several palm trees, standing in all directions upon the rolling hills on all sides of a grand courtyard. And the pool, penned in by the manicured cactus, found itself near the courtyard's grassy lawn, which traveled around the deck's edge. Thomas walked toward the pool as he pondered for a moment, seeming transfixed on the crystal-clear water inside. Leave it to the cartels. He thought years into a global pandemic, they still managed to keep a sparkling pool. Suddenly, feeling his phone in his coat pocket slightly buzz, he pulled it out and pressed a button on it as it began to flash a holographic screen in front of his line of sight. As he began to scroll, he clicked upon a box with a question mark in it. A message from an unknown source. Now, there before him, words appeared across the screen. Thomas looked at the words, seeming to be prepared for what he read. The screen's text simply read, "Status update. Please advise." Thomas looked back to the doors he had just come through, making sure no one was watching as he looked back to his screen. Then, knowing he must move quick as he knew he was keeping Arlo, Thomas quickly typed his response into the holographic keyboard below. "Still too dangerous. Maintain current objective." The screen then went dark as Thomas quickly went inside, carelessly leaving the door open as he did so. Meanwhile, nearly 4,000 miles south, we come to a land known as Peru. And within this land, a United States embassy can be found. An embassy that held a secret from the rest of the American population they swore to protect. And about 10 miles west, away from the prying eyes of the American government, a covert operation was unfolding. Here, within the wilderness, outside of any city borders, was a rundown building, several American military personnel guarding the perimeter. And within this building was a makeshift war room where several American soldiers all dressed in fatigues could be seen. The room was somewhat small, maintaining a desire to function in stealth. While a soldier dutifully minded a laptop he now held upon his knees, he quickly typed a response to a message he'd just received. "Copy that. Maintaining current objective. Over." And with that, The soldier then stood up and walked across the room to one of his superiors and addressed him with a sense of urgency. "Sergeant, Agent Shields is still not in position," he said, gaining a rather quick response from his supervisor. "We need to speed up this process. Inform Shields that we are meeting with the ranking officers of Operation Last State in 3 days. If we want to be on top of this, we need to know what he knows, so we're not caught off guard in this debriefing. We must have prepared answers and avoid this operation from maturing faster than ours, and make sure your communication lines stay secure. If these fuckheads find out we're playing both sides, it'll be the end for all of us. We'll be sent away for treason." "Yes, sir. Understood, sir," the soldier replied. "One other thing, sir. What are we going to do with the Russian?" he asked. "Shields wants him out of the equation as soon as possible. He doesn't want any loose ends getting back to the Kremlin. If Lenkov gets wind of our mission, he would be compromised." His superior then looked behind his shoulder and then back at the reporting soldier in front of him. "I will handle him. You keep tracking Moscow. I want to be informed if anything changes. If Shields wants us to play both sides, we have to do our part to make sure we're not getting fucked in the ass." The officer then began to walk away while ending his conversation. "Thank you, Andrews. That will be all." Andrews then watched his superior head into the next room as he sat down and quickly got back to work. But following this story, one would be wise to take interest in what was unfolding within this adjacent room. As here, a Russian hostage has found himself mixed up with the American traitors. And as Andrews's superior approached the hostage, he began to speak. "I don't want to hear any more of your bullshit. I want to know everything. I want to know everything right fucking now. Tell me now," he said, only to gather an unwanted response from the Russian. "I won't tell you nothing. Fuckhead. You really think we're just gonna sit back and let you have control over everything? We are going to be the ones on the top, motherfucker. Tell us what you know." "Why should I? Fuck you, American trash." That was when another soldier approached the sergeant, and frustrated with his Russian hostage, he threw the man a scowl, signaling their conversation would be continued. And as he turned to address the soldier that had approached him, he began to speak, still with frustration in his voice. "What updates do you have for me, Campbell?" he questioned. And as Campbell held a tablet in his hands, he went over a few developments he'd discovered coming out of the Pentagon. "Sir, it's Operation Last State. They are recruiting, sir. They just sent out the memo. Sir, you meet these qualifications to appoint any of your men." The sergeant then replied, "Good work, Lieutenant. It appears they're moving faster than we expected. Send Andrews. He's already up to date on the operation in question. He will be the perfect mole. Once shit hits the fan, you know this Last State will be relentless. We need to keep our eyes on them. We don't want them preventing any of this shit. Remember, this is our opportunity to remake America. We are the new America, and we need to stay ahead of them at all times. Once Shields is in position, we will be able to begin shifting a large portion of the military to our control. And once the codes are sent and all is said and done, we will have an unwitting portion of the US forces serving by our side. This is our one chance. No missteps, Lieutenant." The lieutenant then followed his sergeant's lead as they each turned to the war room through the door. There, behind several computers, was a brick wall. And there, upon this wall, was an American flag. An American flag with a disturbing twist. This time, America will be perfect. And this time, it will only have one state, our state. A military state. Our founders were wrong, Lieutenant. Democracy is for the weak. This world belongs only to the strong. And as the two slowly stepped through the door of the war room, several soldiers within, working on this nefarious objective, they peered at this flag upon the wall and took it all in. Then, in a quieter tone, the sergeant spoke one last time. To the new America, Lieutenant. To the new America, sir.